Lent is that thing we do every year, to remember. In our whole Christian calendar, Advent and Lent and all of these events are for us to remember exactly what we just sang, to remember the goodness of God. All our lives, all of history, He's been faithful. And today, the second Sunday in Lent, is particularly set aside to remember. In fact, the Latin name for the second Sunday in Lent is reminiscere, which means to remember the goodness of God, to remember His faithfulness. And we're inviting you this Lent to maybe join us in this little practice. There are baskets of stones in that center table. If some of you want to grab those and pass those around, and a couple baskets at the end. And if you'd like to, take a stone out of that basket. And there's a reason for that. And that is that in Scripture, whenever people encountered something really powerful that God had said or done to them in the Old Testament, they would find a stone and they would put it down, or sometimes they would stack stones together. We're kind of using this in the same way. I like that our stones are kind of translucent there. So maybe it's thinking in terms of, I've heard something in a different manner, or I've seen something differently. Or maybe this season the Lord's teaching you something very special and you want to lay that stone down later. Or maybe it's a confession, or maybe just a new insight, or maybe a decision you've made. But at the end of the service, when we take the cup together and the bread, we'll just put our stones on that table, and you put down the stone that's most meaningful to you during this important season. When I was in college, I took a class called Greek and Roman Classics in Translation. Doesn't that sound very intellectual and very pompous? Greek and Roman Classics in Translation. All it really meant was we were going to read Greek and Roman mythology, and the translation was we'd read it in English, which was good because it's the only language I had access to. But you know what I learned in that class? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I didn't learn a thing in that class at all. And I can't really blame the instructor so much as I had just met Carol and we were just started dating, and I was much more interested in Carol than Zeus. And so I skipped a lot of classes, and that's kind of how that went. But I learned later more about the mythology of the time in those days. And something that's very interesting is that for the ancients, their myths and their history became the same thing. They didn't have our set of myths and then our real history. It was all the same thing. They said, we went to this war because the gods had called us to this war. We took this land because the gods had called us. And it was all intertwined together. And the result of that, most of the time, was that their leaders became gods to them. This is certainly true in the pharaohs of Egypt. It's certainly true in the Caesars of Rome. They just became godlike figures. Of course, modern man would never think that way, would we? Interesting thing, in 1832, the United States Congress commissioned a statue of George Washington. They asked a sculptor named Horatio Greeno to build a statue of George Washington, and that was in like 1832, and the statue wasn't completed until 1841. And Horatio Greeno was an American sculptor, but he built it in Italy, and so it was being transported here from Italy. And everybody was expecting this statue of George Washington to be one of him standing there in his uniform, like we always see paintings, with that straight face of his. But when it got here, what Horatio Greeno had done is he had presented George Washington as a Greek god. I actually have a picture of it here. That was the response when it came, There he is in a toga, sitting on a throne with a sword, and our country didn't really know what to do with that. That's not exactly what we had in mind, and they tried to put it in the new Capitol Rotunda, and there's different stories about that. Some said the lighting wasn't good enough, and some said the floor couldn't handle a 10-foot statue that was that heavy, and so they put it outside for a while. And today, if you want to see it, you can go to one of the museums in the Smithsonian. One of them there, it's there. But you laughed at it when you saw that, because that's not really what we think of, and yet it points to this truism that that we've known down through the ages, that when it comes to mythology and history, the victors always write the history, right? Victors were the ones who wrote the history. In ancient times, when a nation was vanquished, a people were vanquished, they were massacred, they were taken as slaves. They didn't write the history, but the victors wrote the history. And so the victors would say, we were victorious because the gods were on our side, because the gods called us. We were promoting virtue. We were doing the right thing, and those people we attacked, well, they were just dogs. We did the world a favor, ridding the world of those people. The victors always wrote the history. The powerful people always wrote the history. Until this thing that we call the Hebrew Scriptures, or what you and I mostly call the Old Testament. The Old Testament's markedly different. It is the story of the nation of Israel. It is the story of an oppressed people. And there were times when the nation was strong, but most of the time they were oppressed. And that history is written by the oppressors. And they saw God in a different way. They saw God not as we are gods, but God is coming to us, and God is helping us. God is somehow on our side. Of course, this comes to fruition in the New Testament where we say that man didn't become God, but God became a man. And yet, we still want to be powerful. Jesus is trying to flip this whole thing for us and let us see what real authority is, what real power is. But because we're human and because of the water we swim in, we still want to be the powerful people. We still want to see strength as might. So Jesus was always having to remind his disciples. Now, he'd spent about 3 years with them, teaching them, showing them in every way. And when we get down to these final weeks of Lent, especially the final week of Jesus on this earth, he talks very frankly to them about it. In the 22nd chapter of Luke, he said this to them. He said, the kings of the nations rule over their subjects, and those in authority over them are called friends of the people. But that's not the way it will be with you. Instead, the greatest among you must become like the person of lower status, and the leader like a servant. So which one is greater? The one who is seated at the table or the one who serves at the table? Well, obviously, the world thinks it's the one who's seated at the table, right? But I am coming to you. I am among you as one who serves. Jesus is just flipping the whole thing upside down as to what greatness is, as to what we're called to. That there's a different history, not that written by the powerful. I've been planning a little trip for about a year now, over a year. I've been looking forward to it, and it's coming this next weekend. And it's funny, I've been planning this trip for like a year, and when I began preparing for this message, thinking over the last couple weeks, I realized that this trip I'm going on is a commemoration of the weak people writing history, the oppressed people writing history. I'm going to drive down to Nashville and pick up my youngest daughter. Then we're going to drive down to Alabama, to Selma and Montgomery, Alabama, for an annual remembrance. The annual remembrance is the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or it has come to be known as Black Sunday. Now, you may know about Black Sunday, but just kind of to review, in 1965, when black people did not really have the right to vote. Oh, on paper they had the right to vote, but they didn't really have the right to vote. There were poll taxes. There were literacy tests. There was just great intimidation from the Klansmen and from local politicians. And so the civil rights movement was revolving around a lot of things, but it was really revolving around really making voting accessible to everyone. And a young man named John Lewis, he's in that second picture right there on the right, guy in the light trench coat, 25 years old, was leading this march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital of Alabama, in order to emphasize the need for voting rights. Well, they got to Selma and they got to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a bridge named for a Confederate war general who became the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Edmund Pettus. And as they began to cross that bridge, this whole thing, ahead of time, it caused some consternation. When they were saying, we're going to march from Selma to Montgomery, Governor George Wallace said, no, you're not. He sent in the state troopers to the bridge to stop it right there. And they got to this point where we see where the state troopers are saying to John Lewis, you are not going one step further. And 600 people were behind him, and he thought, well, we're not going back. What do we do? Well, he did what they had been taught to do. He said, we're going to pray. Everybody kneel down. And that's what you see in this picture over here, that long line of people kneeling. And they really didn't get a chance to pray because as soon as they knelt down, the order came out and the melee started. All hell broke loose. The state troopers went in with billy clubs and even bullwhips and tear gas and just decimated them. And you see right there in this middle picture, John Lewis had received a blow to the top of his head. It fractured his skull. And he's on the ground underneath that pile. He can't see because of the tear gas that's been in his eyes and because of the concussion he's having and the excruciating pain of having his skull fractured. And he's down there, and he later said, I thought we were all going to die. And then he said, I thought I was going to die. But I thought this is what I was supposed to be doing right now. Amelia Boynton, she was a person who had worked so hard for voters' rights in and around that area. She was 59 years old, and she was beaten unconscious, and people thought she was dying as they dragged her away. It was a victory of the powerful. Was it? I'm sure that there were rulers around the world who said, yeah, they did it right. You got to stand up. Yeah, might is right and power is right, and that's the way we do things. And they did it right. But there were a whole lot of people around the world who knew who really won there. They knew what happened. A couple days later, they were going to try the march again, and it didn't happen. So later, on March 21st of 1965, they marched. This time, the country had seen what had happened. And the nation was so embarrassed that they did walk from Selma to Montgomery because President Johnson sent a police escort for them to go. And 5 months later, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. So every year, Americans from around the country, and this year I get to be one of them, from around the country gather together and walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge every year to remember that might doesn't make right. That there are some things that can only be fought through soul force. And John Lewis, a devout Christ follower, knew that to follow Christ in his calling meant to reverse all the concept of power in our world. Jesus also had an annual thing that he did, as every Jew did, an annual event to talk about the same concept, how God would deliver the weak. Of course, Jesus was a Jew, and his background was of the people of Israel, and they told the story every year at Passover. They told the story of their deliverance from Egypt. We're the mightiest nation in the world. Egypt had been brought to its knees, and the Israelites, after 400 years of slavery, walked out of Egypt and headed toward the promised land. They walked out of Egypt, and as they went out, the people in Egypt gave them gifts. And it was the whole irony is that they used to plunder nations through power, and the Israelites ended up plundering the nation through peace and let God deliver them. So every year, every Jew would celebrate Passover. It was this whole celebration. It has changed over the years, but it's still celebrated today. It is the celebration of freedom by the power of God and not by the power of mankind. So Jesus is meeting with his disciples for the Passover meal. He'd been with them for about 3 years, so this is probably their third or fourth Passover together. And as they gather in this room, to take the elements, he does something strange. Now, the Passover was a meal that had many aspects to it that were all symbolic, like it had the bitter herbs that they would eat to think about their bitter enslavement. It had salt to remember the tears that were shed, and it had some wine. But before they partook of the elements, Jesus did something kind of strange to them, kind of strange to us. John picks it up in John 13. It says, Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the table, took off his outer robes, and put on a linen towel. He tied it around his waist, and he poured the water into a wash basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he was wearing. Now, I want you to hear this. He said, Jesus knew the Father had given him everything. Everything was Jesus. He had the power to do whatever he wanted. He knew that he had come from God and was returning to God. So what did he do with all that power? He washed their feet. Now, the foot washing thing is kind of a strange thing for. Any of you ever gone to a foot washing service? Yeah, it's the most awkward thing in the world, isn't it? I mean, it's good, but it's like, washing feet. Well, in that culture, foot washing was something they did all the time. It was just an act of hospitality. Most of the people in that really dry dirt roads, sandy roads, dryness, they had hot, tired feet. Most of them didn't have shoes of any kind, and so if someone came into your home, it was just kind of a hospitality thing, like you or I would bring someone in our home and say, can I get you something to drink? Sit over there. It's just hospitality. And the custom was that usually the servant would do it, but most people didn't have servants. So it was the person of lowest stature, which generally was a female and definitely the youngest one. So the youngest female in the house would wash the feet. And so Jesus is in a room with his disciples, and it's a borrowed room, so there's no host there. But it seems like maybe the youngest guy in the room would have said, let me wash your feet. We don't know for sure, but they didn't do it. And the reason, I think, may have been something that the gospel writers pointed out, that just prior to this, they'd had a little row. They'd had a little argument. I like the way the old versions say, a dispute broke out among them. They just were fussing at each other. And the disciples had been arguing about, are you ready for this? Arguing about who's the greatest. They'd been walking 3 years with this man who's taught them humility and everything, and they get down to it, and all of a sudden they're arguing about, well, which one of us is the most important disciple, I don't know. I've thought many times, I wonder what that conversation was like. Was like Peter saying, well, I was the first one of us, he called, or maybe Matthew was saying, well, you all are fishermen. I at least worked for the government, and maybe Andrew and John were saying, yeah, but we saw some stuff you guys didn't see. But they were actually arguing about which one of them was the most important of the disciples. And while they're arguing about this, they're in this room, and all of a sudden they look down and Jesus is washing their feet. I think that pride, he thinks he's better than me. I'm not washing his feet. I think that pride just kind of drained out of them. You think maybe when they saw Jesus doing that? And then Jesus says this to them. After he washed their feet, he put on his robes and he returned to his place at the table. He said to them, do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you speak correctly because I am. But if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too must wash each other's feet. I've given you an example. Just as I have done, you must also do. I assure you, servants aren't greater than their master, nor are those who are sent greater than those who sent them. Since you know these things, you'll be happy if you do them. I fear over the history of Christianity, there's this feeling that a lot of Christians have is that we come to this time of the year and Jesus went to the cross for us and Jesus did the hard part so we could have the easy part. Jesus accomplished God's will for humankind, and we just get to reap the benefits. But Jesus washed their feet, and he said, I've set an example for you. Now, he wasn't talking just about physical foot washing, was he? We all know what he was saying. He was saying there's an attitude, there's a spirit I want you to have. Repeatedly, he'd said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. And I'd like us to kind of resurrect that imagery that's been down there through the centuries, that the cross is the image of Christianity, but the towel is also an image of Christianity. The cross shows what he did for us, and the towel shows what he calls us to do. So there he is at this Passover meal. He's washed their feet, and he's reorienting to them to what he's taught them all along. What real strength is, what real power is, what it really means to follow God. Not to be the greatest, not to be the powerful, not to say that God has anointed me to lord it over others, but just the opposite. They ate the bitter herbs. They ate the various elements of the Passover meal. And then, as was their custom, they took the wine. Now, the Passover meal on that day had 4 wine glasses. And all were very symbolic of what happened when the Jews were delivered from Egypt. The first cup was called the cup of sanctification. Now that word sanctify, it simply means to be set apart. Like in the Old Testament, it said they would sanctify the altar. It meant that the altar was just used for a holy purpose. You didn't take the altar and use it as a workbench. It was just for the temple. So the cup of sanctification was saying that we are set apart. We're God's people. We're called God's people, and that's why we observe this. And so they would drink the cup of sanctification. The second cup was the cup of affliction, the cup of the plagues, the cup of the bitterness and the sorrow of what we went through. And so together they drank the cup of affliction. The third cup is the cup of redemption. That's the cup that says God will deliver. And we don't know for sure, but we suppose, and scholars believe, that this is the cup of redemption that Jesus took, and he said, this is my blood. Redemption comes from the giving of my life. This is my blood. This is redemption, which is poured out for you. Man, talk about a curveball. They knew this liturgy. They'd had it every year. And now all of a sudden, Jesus is saying, this is me. This is my blood, which is shed for you. And in one of the Gospels, he specifically says, I want all of you to drink this. And they took that cup. The fourth cup is the cup of rejoicing and praise. And after Jesus took this cup, he said, I won't drink again. I won't drink any more wine until I drink it anew in God's kingdom, in why I came. You see, Jesus came, and his life and death and resurrection was to invert the world as we know it. And he said, then we will rejoice. But right now we have a cross to go to. I think it's so important that we keep remembering. That's why we do this again and again and again. Because throughout the course of a year, throughout the course of my life, I have this tremendous ability to forget important things. Maybe you do too. I have this tremendous ability to lose perspective on what life is. And the bread and the wine and the remembrance helps us to reorient life back to what it's supposed to be. It is bigger than we can imagine, and it's smaller than we can imagine. It's more grandiose than we can imagine, the God of the heavenlies coming to us, and it is so humble and intimate that we become like him by becoming servants. You know, we have these 4 accounts of this Last Supper. We call it sometimes the Passover meal. It's like many things in our 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We kind of take bits and pieces from each one. We don't usually like to read Scripture that way, but there were events there were circumstances around these events that happened differently, like some things Matthew would mention, some things Luke would mention, some things Mark would mention, some things John would mention. And in all of those words over the years, there's been two phrases that have really stuck out to me. One is, they're actually both from Luke. But the two that have stuck out to me more than any is when Jesus said in Luke 22:15, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. The pathos and the love and the community that Jesus needed when he was about to go to the cross. He says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you. And then he said, don't ever forget. Don't ever forget. Do this in remembrance of me. So Pastor Corey's going to lead us to the table. But let's go to the table knowing that we're not going as uninvited guests. We're going to the open table of Jesus, the one who says, I have earnestly desired to be with you. And we're doing this to remember.